Dead dirt doesn't grow food. Sounds obvious, right? But here's the thing. About 40% of the world's agricultural land is dead or dying. Not metaphorically dead. Actually dead. No nutrients, no life. Nothing. Just compacted dust that used to be soil. And when scientists dumped millions of earthworms into some of the most lifeless dirt on the planet, like, actually alive. So how does that even work? And why aren't we doing this everywhere? Stick around. Let's start with what most people get wrong about dirt. You probably think soil is just well ground up rocks with some dead leaves mixed in. Close, but wildly off. Healthy soil is less rock and more rainforest. We're talking about one of the most complex ecosystems on Earth. Packed into a handful of dirt you'd barely notice. There are more living organisms than people on the entire planet. Billions of bacteria, miles of fungal networks, thousands of protozoa and nematodes. And holding court over this microscopic metropolis? Earthworms. The ultimate underground engineers. Charles Darwin spent 39 years studying earthworms, not part-time, full obsession mode. And in 1881, he published an entire book about them, calling earthworms one of the most important creatures in the history of the world. Not exactly the hot take you'd expect from the guy who figured out evolution. But Darwin knew something. Most people still don't. They build it. Here's how it works. An earthworm eats its way through dirt. Literally. It consumes soil, dead plant matter, and organic debris as it tunnels underground. Then it processes all that material through its gut, where bacteria break it down even further. What comes out the other end? Worm castings, which sounds disgusting until you realize it's basically super fertilizer. Worm castings contain 5 times more nitrogen, 7 times more phosphorus, and 11 times more potassium than the surrounding soil. That's not a typo. One worm poops out better dirt than it ate. But that's not even the best part. As worms tunnel, they create channels. These aren't random holes. They're precisely engineered air and water highways that let oxygen reach plant roots and allow water to penetrate deep into the ground instead of running off. A healthy population of earthworms can create thousands of miles of tunnels per acre. Suddenly, hard-packed soil becomes spongy, aerated, and fertile. The worms aren't just in the soil. They are the soil. Now here's where things get dark. Most farmland doesn't have worms anymore. And I don't mean a few less worms. I mean 0. Ghost towns underground. How did that happen? Let's rewind to the 1950s. After World War II, agriculture went through what's politely called the Green Revolution. Sounds nice, right? It wasn't. The idea was simple. Use synthetic fertilizers and pesticides to maximize crop yields and feed a growing global population. And it worked. For a while, crop production skyrocketed. Hunger decreased. Everyone celebrated. But there was a problem nobody wanted to talk about. Those synthetic fertilizers are salts, highly concentrated chemical salts. And when you dump them onto soil year after year, they don't just feed plants, they kill everything else. The bacteria, the fungi, the microorganisms, and yes, the earthworms. Pesticides made it worse. Herbicides made it catastrophic. Within a few decades, industrial farming had turned living soil into lifeless dirt. And it shows. In the 1960s, it took about 1 ton of soil to produce 1 ton of food. Today, it takes nearly 4 tons of soil to grow the same amount. The soil isn't working anymore. It's just a place to hold plants upright while we dump chemicals on them. The global food system is running on a substrate that's basically dead. The United Nations estimated that at current rates, the world has about 60 harvests left before we run out of usable topsoil. 60. That's within your lifetime. Maybe within your kid's lifetime. This isn't some distant eco-worry. This is happening now. So what do you do when your soil is dead? One option is to abandon it. Let it sit for a decade or two and hope nature fixes it. But we don't have that kind of time. The other option? Bring in reinforcements. Enter the worms. In 2009, a team of scientists in the Palouse region of Washington state decided to try something radical. The Palouse used to be one of the most fertile wheat-growing regions in the world. Rolling hills covered in thick prairie grasses. Rich topsoil going down several feet. By the early 2000s, disaster. Decades of industrial wheat farming had compacted the soil, eroded the topsoil, and killed almost all biological activity underground. Crop yields were tanking. Farmers were pouring on more fertilizer just to keep yields steady. It wasn't working. The scientists had a wild idea. What if they reintroduced earthworms? Not just a few. Millions. They targeted fields that hadn't seen a worm in decades. They sourced worms from healthier regions, mostly red wigglers and night crawlers, species known for aggressive tunneling and high reproduction rates. Then they released them. Hundreds of thousands of worms per acre. At first, nothing happened. Which makes sense. You can't just drop worms into dead soil and expect miracles. The ground was too compacted, too dry. Not enough organic matter for the worms to eat. Many of them died. But not all of them. The survivors started doing what worms do. They ate. They tunneled. They pooped. Something shifted. The soil structure started to change. It became less brick-like, more crumbly. Water infiltration improved. Instead of runoff, rain was sinking into the ground. Plant roots could penetrate deeper. Farmers noticed their crops looked healthier, even though they hadn't changed their planting practices. Organic matter was increasing. Nitrogen levels were rising. The dirt was waking up. By year 3, the difference was undeniable. Fields with earthworms were yielding 15 to 30% more wheat than fields without them. And here's the kicker. The farmers weren't using more fertilizer. They were using less. The worms were doing the work. They were building soil faster than it was being depleted. Now you might be thinking, okay, cool story, but Washington State has pretty decent soil to begin with. In the Loess Plateau in central China, erosion and over-farming had turned millions of acres into a dusty wasteland. This region used to be the cradle of Chinese civilization, fertile river valleys, thick forests, abundant wildlife. By the 1990s, practically a desert. The Yellow River, one of China's most important waterways, was choking on sediment. Dust storms were common. Poverty was rampant. The land couldn't support the people anymore. In 1994, the Chinese government launched one of the most ambitious ecological restoration projects in history. They terraced hillsides to prevent erosion, planted millions of trees, and banned farming on the steepest slopes. But the soil itself was still dead, compacted, lifeless. Nothing would grow, so they brought in the worms. Not just earthworms, but an entire army of decomposers, beetles, fungi, bacteria, all carefully sourced and introduced in stages. The worms were the foundation. They loosened the soil, created tunnels, and started cycling nutrients. Within 5 years, vegetation started returning. Not the scraggly weeds you'd expect, but thick grasses and shrubs. Trees that were barely surviving started thriving. Streams that had dried up started flowing again. By 2015, the Loess Plateau had gone from ecological disaster zone to one of the most successful restoration projects on Earth. Vegetation cover increased from 17% to over 70%. Soil erosion dropped by 90%. Farmers' incomes tripled. And it all started underground with millions of worms slowly, methodically, rebuilding the foundation. But here's the part that blows my mind. The worms didn't just fix the soil. They changed the water cycle. Healthy soil with good worm activity acts like a sponge. It absorbs water during rains and releases it slowly over time. Dead soil? It's basically pavement. Water runs right off, causing floods downstream and droughts everywhere else. When the worms returned to the Loess Plateau, the region's water retention improved so much that seasonal flooding decreased and dry season water availability increased. The worms didn't just fix the dirt. They fixed the weather. Now let's talk about Africa. Specifically, the Sahel region, that band of semi-arid land just south of the Sahara Desert. This area is home to some of the poorest countries on Earth. And the soil situation? Catastrophic. Decades of overgrazing, deforestation, and climate change have left vast stretches of land unable to support crops. Famine is common. Malnutrition is rampant. People are starving because the ground won't grow food anymore. In Niger, a farmer named Yakuba Sawadogo decided to try something his ancestors used to do. He dug pits, called zai pits, in the dry season and filled them with manure and organic matter. Then he waited for the rains. When the water came, it pooled in the pits instead of running off. Seeds planted in the pits had a much better chance of survival. Earthworms started appearing. Not many at first, just a few. But they multiplied. And as they did, the soil around the pits improved. Plants grew taller, roots went deeper. Within a few years, Sawadogo's barren plot of land had transformed into a thriving forest. Trees, crops, wildlife, all on land that was supposed to be dead. They took the organic matter in the pits and spread it throughout the soil. They created pathways for water and air. They turned dust into dirt, and in doing so they turned a desert back into farmland. Today, over 5 million hectares of land in the Sahel have been restored using techniques that rely heavily on encouraging earthworm populations. That's an area roughly the size of Costa Rica. And it's still growing. Farmers who were on the edge of starvation are now growing surplus crops. Villages that relied on food aid are now self-sufficient, all because someone figured out how to bring the worms back. So if worms are this powerful, why aren't we using them everywhere? The answer is complicated and frustrating. First, industrial agriculture is locked into a chemical dependency cycle. Farmers have been told for 70 years that synthetic fertilizers are the only way to maximize yields. And for a while, that was true, but now we're hitting diminishing returns. More fertilizer doesn't mean more food, it just means more expense and more environmental damage. But the companies that make fertilizers are very, very good at lobbying governments and convincing farmers that biology can't compete with chemistry. Second, earthworm populations don't bounce back overnight. It takes years for worms to recolonize dead soil, especially if that soil is still being drenched in pesticides. Most farmers operate on thin margins. They can't afford to wait 3 years for worms to do their thing. They need results now, so they stick with chemicals, even though it's slowly killing the land. Third, there's an information problem. Most people, including farmers, don't understand soil biology. It's not taught in agricultural schools. It's not discussed in farming communities. The focus is on what you put on the soil, not what's in it. So even when farmers notice their soil is dying, they don't think to look underground for solutions. They just buy more fertilizer. But things are changing. Slowly, farmers are starting to experiment with cover crops, reduced tillage, and composting, all of which create better conditions for earthworms. Some are even buying worms commercially and introducing them to their fields. Not in the millions yet, but it's a start, and the results are hard to ignore. Farms that transition to worm-friendly practices see their soil organic matter double within 5 years. Water retention improves, fertilizer costs drop, crop resilience increases. And here's the wild part: the carbon sequestration. Healthy soil packed with worms pulls carbon out of the atmosphere and locks it underground. Some estimates suggest that restoring global soil health could offset 10 to 15% of annual carbon emissions. The worms aren't just feeding us, they're fighting climate change. Let's get specific about what worms actually do at the chemical level, because it's genuinely nuts. When a worm eats organic matter, its gut becomes a biochemical reactor. Bacteria in the worm's digestive system break down complex organic molecules into simpler compounds that plants can use. Proteins become amino acids. Cellulose becomes simple sugars. Minerals get chelated, meaning they're bound to organic molecules that plants can easily absorb. But here's where it gets weird. Worm castings also contain growth hormones. Actual plant growth hormones. Auxins, gibberellins, cytokinins. These aren't just nutrients. They're signals that tell plants to grow faster, develop stronger roots, and resist disease. A plant growing in soil rich with worm castings isn't just better fed. It's being actively coached to thrive. And then there's the microbiome effect. Worm castings are loaded with beneficial bacteria and fungi. These microorganisms colonize plant roots and form symbiotic relationships. Mycorrhizal fungi, for example, extend the reach of plant roots by orders of magnitude, allowing plants to access water and nutrients far beyond their physical root zone. In return, plants feed the fungi with sugars produced through photosynthesis. It's an underground economy, and the worms are the central bank. There's also emerging research on worm mucus. Yes, seriously, as worms tunnel, they secrete a slimy coating that helps them move through soil. This mucus contains antimicrobial compounds that suppress harmful bacteria and fungi. Basically, worms leave behind a protective coating that makes the soil healthier and safer for plants. They're not just gardeners. They're also security guards. Now I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds too good to be true. Where's the catch? There are a few. Earthworms aren't native to all ecosystems, and introducing them where they don't belong can cause problems. In some northern forests, for example, there were no earthworms for thousands of years. The ecosystems adapted to slow decomposition. The rapid breakdown of leaf litter disrupted native plant communities. So yes, you can have too much of a good thing. But in agricultural contexts, where the goal is to grow food, earthworms are almost universally beneficial. The key is matching the right worm species to the right environment. Red wigglers thrive in compost-rich environments. Night crawlers prefer deeper, cooler soil. Knowing which worm to use makes all the difference. There's also the issue of invasive species. Not all earthworms are created equal, and introducing the wrong species can cause ecological havoc. Asian jumping worms, for example, are an invasive species spreading across the United States. They reproduce rapidly, consume organic matter faster than native species, and leave behind castings that are too fine and nutrient-poor. They're basically the fast fashion of the worm world: cheap, quick, and ultimately destructive. So if you're going to introduce worms, you need to be smart about it. Use native or well-established non-invasive species. Make sure the soil has enough organic matter to support them. And for the love of all that's holy, stop dumping pesticides that kill them off. Here's the bottom line. We've spent the last 70 years treating soil like a passive medium, something to pour chemicals onto, a substrate. But soil isn't passive. It's alive. And when it's healthy, it does things we barely understand. It filters water, stores carbon, cycles nutrients, and feeds the world. And at the center of that system, doing the grunt work nobody sees, are earthworms. The Romans called them intestines of the earth. Cleopatra declared them sacred. Darwin dedicated the twilight of his career to studying them. And modern science is finally catching up to what ancient farmers knew all along. If you want good soil, you need worms. Lots of them. The crazy thing is, we don't need some high-tech solution. We don't need genetic engineering or nanobots or artificial fertilizers. We just need to stop killing the creatures that have been doing this job for 600 million years. Stop poisoning the soil. Add organic matter. Let the worms do their thing. It's not sexy. It's not fast. But it works. And in places where people have tried it, really committed to it, the results speak for themselves. Dead soil comes back to life. Farms become profitable again. Rivers run clearer. Forests return. And all because someone decided to dump millions of worms into the ground. And see what happened. So yeah, worms. They're not just bait for fishing. They're architects. Engineers, chemists, and farmers all rolled into one slimy package. And if we're smart, we'll stop taking them for granted and start rebuilding our relationship with the ground beneath our feet. Before it's too late.